The heavy, rusted iron hinges of the oak door screamed as Lyra Sterling pushed her entire body weight against the damp, unyielding wood. The bitter, howling winter wind of the northern border fought her with every ounce of its freezing strength. It drove a relentless flurry of razor-sharp ice crystals against her pale, wind-chapped cheeks, stinging like 1,000 tiny blades. She gritted her teeth, her breath plumbing in violent, ragged white clouds, and shoved one final time. The door gave way with a resounding, violent crack, slamming against the interior stone wall of the abandoned forest cottage. She stumbled over the worn threshold, her boots slipping on a thick layer of frost that had crept inside under the warped doorframe. With trembling, numb fingers, she threw her exhausted weight against the oak panel again, forcing it shut against the raging blizzard outside. She threw the heavy iron bolt into place, locking the storm out and securing her isolation. The sudden silence that fell over the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating, ringing loudly in her freezing ears. Lyra leaned back against the solid wood, her chest heaving as she closed her eyes. The grueling 3-day march through the knee-deep snowdrifts of the Thornwood territory had completely drained the life from her trembling limbs. Her woolen cloak was soaked through, heavy as chainmail, and her boots were caked in a thick, unyielding layer of frozen mud. But the profound physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the hollow, agonizing void echoing beneath her ribs. Where a warm, vibrant pack bond had hummed just a week ago, there was now only a jagged, frost-bitten ache near her collarbone. The physical feedback of the severed bond was a constant, throbbing agony, like a shard of black ice embedded directly into her soul. Every breath she took felt shallow, constricted by the immense weight of the rejection she had suffered. The public rejection at the ceremonial altar still replayed in the dark, silent corners of her mind, a nightmare painted in shades of frost and blood. The cruel, echoing laughter of her former alpha, the derisive sneers of the high-ranking omegas, the absolute, stony indifference of the elders who had watched her be stripped of her name and rank. She did not cry when they cast her out. She did not fall to her knees. She did not beg for the mercy of a lesser position among the servants. Instead, it became the moment Lyra Sterling's entire world shattered, but she refused to let them see the pieces fall. She had simply unclasped the silver moonstone pin from her cloak, laid it quietly upon the blood-stained granite of the altar, and turned her back on the only home she had ever known. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took nothing with her except the torn clothes on her back and the deeply buried secret of her true lineage. There was no grand dramatic exit, no final curse thrown at her abusers. The silence of her departure had been absolute, a quiet severing of ties that left her utterly untethered in a brutal, winter-ravaged world. Her resilience was her only armor, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let the frost consume her entirely. Opening her eyes, the outcast surveyed her new sanctuary. The woodland cottage was small, drafty, and smelled overwhelmingly of damp pine needles, decaying floorboards, and decades of undisturbed, suffocating dust. Pale, fragmented moonlight filtered through the cracked glass of a single, narrow window, illuminating the desolate state of the room. A rusted iron kettle sat abandoned in a sunken hearth of blackened stone. In the far corner, a heavy, rustic wooden bed frame lay draped in the shredded, moth-eaten remains of a wool blanket. Cobwebs hung thick from the low, sagging ceiling beams, swaying gently in the frigid draughts that bled through the decaying mortar. It was a bleak, lonely ruin, clinging desperately to the edge of the known territories. To anyone else, it would be a death sentence. To her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She peeled the freezing, wet cloak from her aching shoulders and hung it over the back of a splintered wooden chair. Her body shivered violently, a deep, somatic tremor that rattled her very bones, but she refused to surrender to the cold. Physical labor was the only remedy for the creeping despair that threatened to pull her under. She moved toward the hearth, Kneeling on the freezing, uneven stone, the ash in the pit was cold and damp. Useless for holding a spark, she used her bare, calloused hands to scoop the wet sludge into a broken wooden bucket, her knuckles turning a bruised, mottled purple in the freezing air. Every sweeping motion sent a dull, throbbing ache radiating through her shoulders, but she welcomed the pain. It grounded her. It proved she was still alive. It proved she had survived the crossing when they had expected her to die. Once the hearth was finally cleared, she gathered a small handful of dry pine needles and brittle birch twigs from a pile near the rotting back door. She arranged them meticulously in the center of the stones, creating a small, fragile nest for the fire. She did not reach for a flint. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a slow, grounding breath, reaching deep into the hollow space inside her chest. Beneath the trauma of the severed pack bond, beneath the crushing exhaustion and the fear, a tiny, buried ember of ancient magic still pulsed. It was a forbidden magic, a golden solar warmth that belonged to a bloodline long thought, eradicated by the ruling lunar matriarchs. She focused her mind on that singular point of light, coaxing it forward through her shivering, ice-cold veins, drawing upon the ancestral strength she had spent a lifetime hiding from the world. A faint, brilliant golden glow illuminated the translucent skin of her fingertips. The air immediately surrounding her hands grew warm, smelling faintly of summer grass and heated honey, a stark, impossible contrast to the bitter winter frost gripping the cottage. She gently pressed her glowing index finger against the dry pine needles. The wood smoked instantly, then flared into a bright, steady orange flame. She withdrew her hand quickly, extinguishing her magic before it could drain what little stamina she had left. She fed larger sticks into the growing fire, watching the shadows dance wildly against the crumbling, ancient walls. The golden warmth of the fire began to push back the freezing chill of the room. For the first time in her life, she did not have to look over her shoulder to see if someone had caught her using the light. As the temperature in the small room began to slowly rise, she found a stiff, brittle broom made of bound birch branches and set to work on the floorboards. She dragged the heavy bristles across the warped wood, sweeping away the layers of dead oak leaves and accumulated dirt. The rhythmic, scratching sound of the sweeping filled the silence, a mundane, grounding repetition that settled her racing, terrified heart. She accepted her absolute invisibility in this vast, terrifying world. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. The pack would not search for her. They had already erased her from their ledgers, scrubbed her scent from the communal halls, and forgotten her face entirely. She was free to exist in the quiet shadows, sovereign over this tiny, forgotten kingdom of dust and drafty corners. Hours passed in a state of meditative, exhausting labor. She scrubbed the rusted kettle with a handful of rough river sand, drew fresh water from a half-frozen well just outside the back door, and set it over the fire to boil. She unrolled a small woven canvas sack she had carried across the border, revealing a meager supply of dried mint leaves, crushed willow bark, and a few precious, golden-veined herbs she had cultivated in secret. She carefully selected a solar-infused rowan leaf, crumbling the dried edges into the boiling water. The steam that rose from the kettle carried the scent of sun-baked earth, a stark contrast to the deathly chill pressing against the cabin walls. She brewed a harsh, bitter tea, wrapping her freezing hands around the hot iron of her cup. The intense warmth seeped into her palms, slowly thawing the rigid stiffness in her joints. She sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, the firelight casting long, protective shadows over her exhausted frame. The cottage was clean, the fire was hot, and she was finally, truly alone. The wind outside the cabin walls escalated into a furious, shrieking gale, rattling the cracked window panes and threatening to tear the heavy wooden shingles from the roof. She took a slow sip of the mint tea, letting the scalding liquid burn a path down her throat, grounding her firmly in the present moment. She stared into the mesmerizing, shifting embers of the hearth, allowing the heavy, oppressive exhaustion of the last 3 days to finally pull at her eyelids. The physical toll of the severed mate bond was a constant, throbbing ache, but the warmth of the fire provided a fragile temporary barrier against the pain. She was just beginning to drift into a light, uneasy doze when a sound abruptly shattered the silence of the room. It was not the wind. It was not the settling of the ancient wooden beams, nor the crackle of the burning pine. It was a low, ragged whimper, so faint it was barely audible over the roaring storm outside. Lyra froze. The ceramic cup halted halfway to her lips, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. The wilderness bordering Thornwood was notoriously unforgiving, swarming with rogue shifters, feral beasts, and starving predators, driven mad by the endless winter. She slowly, silently lowered her cup to the warm stone hearth. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, warning rhythm that echoed in her ears. She listened, her senses straining against the ambient noise of the storm. For a long, suffocating minute, there was absolutely nothing. She almost convinced herself it was an auditory hallucination, born of exhaustion, trauma, and the lingering ache of her severed bond. Then, the sound came again. A weak, desperate scratching of tiny claws against wood, followed by a wet, rattling gasp for air. The noise was originating from the inside of the cottage. Her grey eyes darted around the dimly lit room, scanning the heavy, oppressive shadows that pooled in the corners. The sound was coming from the far side of the chamber. Beneath the heavy, rustic wooden bed frame, she had not yet found the strength to move or clean beneath. A deep, primal instinct urged her to flee back into the storm, to abandon the shelter, rather than face whatever feral creature had taken refuge in the dark. But the brutal reality of the blizzard outside meant certain death. She had no choice. She reached out and wrapped her calloused hand around the heavy iron fireplace poker, the metal still slightly warm from the hearth. She rose to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest, and gripped the makeshift weapon with both hands. She crossed the room with agonizing slowness, carefully placing each step to avoid the creaking floorboards. The draft blowing from the cracked window above the bed sent a shiver down her spine, raising the fine hairs on her arms. As she closed the distance, the whimpering grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of something in unimaginable physical agony, a creature clinging desperately to the very edge of mortality. The terror in her chest began to shift, slowly warring with the deep, innate empathy that had always been her greatest weakness. She reached the edge of the bed and paused, her knuckles entirely white around the iron poker. She took a steadying breath, dropped slowly to her knees, and lowered her head to look into the suffocating darkness beneath the wooden frame. At first she saw nothing but a wall of absolute, impenetrable blackness. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the lack of light, the dim, flickering reflection of the hearth fire caught a pair of eyes hiding in the furthest corner. They were silver-grey, wide with primal terror, but entirely glazed with a thick, milky film of lethal fever. The moment she made eye contact, a wave of unnatural, blistering heat rolled out from beneath the bed, hitting her face like a blast from an open furnace. It was not the heat of a normal animal's body. It smelled deeply of rotting copper, burnt silver, and the sickening ozone-heavy stench of dark, ancestral curse magic. Lyra loosened her grip on the iron poker, letting the heavy metal tip rest quietly against the floorboards. She recognized that vile scent. It was the distinct olfactory signature of a lethal silver poison, a toxin designed specifically to burn through the bloodline of a high-ranking wolf shifter from the inside out. It was a cowardly, insidious magic, meant to induce maximum suffering before death. Whatever was hiding beneath her bed was not a wild forest predator. It was a shifter, and it was dying a horrific, agonizing death. "Hey," she whispered, her voice cracking from days of disuse. She kept her tone incredibly soft, completely devoid of any aggressive alpha cadence. "It is all right. I am not going to hurt you." The creature responded with a violent, full-body shudder, letting out a sharp, pathetic whine that tore right through Lyra's healing heart. She slowly reached her empty left hand under the bed, keeping her palm open and facing upward to show she meant no harm. As her fingers breached the shadows, a tiny, matted bundle of silver fur lunged forward. Tiny, needle-sharp teeth snapped viciously at her fingertips in a weak, desperate defense of a dying predator. The jaws clamped down on the edge of her woolen sleeve, lacking the strength to even break the fabric. The tiny wolf pup held on for a fraction of a second before its body gave out entirely. Its jaw went slack, and its chin hit the dusty floorboards with a pitiful, hollow thud. Lyra immediately abandoned the iron poker. She slid both her hands under the frail, motionless body, her fingers sinking into fur that was completely slick with dark, clotting blood and freezing sweat. The pup was dangerously underweight, its fragile ribcage protruding sharply beneath her thumbs. But what shocked her most was the temperature of its skin. The small creature was shivering so violently it vibrated in her hands, yet its body burned like a molten coal. She gently pulled the unconscious wolf into the open room, cradling the tiny, limp form against her chest as she hurried back toward the safety and light of the burning hearth. She knelt on the warm stones, resting the pup in her lap to examine the extent of the damage. In the bright, dancing orange light of the fire, the truth of the creature revealed itself in a series of devastating details. The pup possessed a coat of pure, unbroken silver fur, a genetic rarity unseen outside of the highest noble bloodlines. Its paws were massive for its current size, indicating it would grow into an absolute behemoth of a wolf. But the most terrifying detail was not its genetic markers or the severe oozing laceration on its flank. It was the object secured tightly around the pup's throat. Woven directly into a thick, reinforced collar of black dragon leather was a heavy, intricate emblem forged of shimmering silver-grey metal. It was a perfect, flawless crescent moon, pierced vertically by a broadsword. Lyra stopped breathing. The air in the small cottage seemed to freeze entirely in her lungs. She knew that mark. Every wolf in the 3 territories knew that mark. It was the crescent royal emblem, the absolute, undeniable crest of the Alpha King's sovereign bloodline. Her trembling fingers reached out, gently brushing against a small secondary silver tag, dangling beside the massive royal crest. The metal was hot to the touch, radiating the same cursed fever that was boiling the pup alive. Stamped deep into the silver plate, filled with black enamel, was a single name. Marith Valdron, the missing heir, the silent prince, who had been kidnapped from the capital stronghold 3 months ago, an event that had driven Kalin Valdron, the most feared and ruthless Alpha King in recorded history, into a state of absolute feral madness. The entire realm was bleeding as the king tore apart rival packs, searching for his stolen son. Kalin's grief was a storm that threatened to drown the continent, and his vengeance was absolute. And here, in a forgotten, rotting cottage at the edge of nowhere, the royal heir was currently bleeding to death in the lap of a banished outcast. A sudden, terrifying wave of maternal protectiveness roared to life inside Lyra, flooding the hollow, agonizing space in her chest with a fierce, unstoppable purpose. The fear of being discovered, the terror of holding the most important hostage in the world, evaporated instantly. She looked down at the fragile, burning creature, her thumb gently stroking the matted silver fur between his ears, feeling the faint, erratic flutter of his fading heartbeat beneath the skin. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my Marith," she whispered into the quiet, shadowed room, repeating the ancient mantra her own mother had taught her before she died. "Smallness is a gift. Use it." As if hearing her voice, the tiny wolf pup let out one final, ragged sigh. He weakly shifted his heavy head, pressing his burning, feverish nose directly against her collarbone, right over the jagged scar of her severed pack bond. The moment his skin made contact with her scar, a violent, blinding jolt of golden, solar warmth pulsed through her veins. It was not the spark of her healing magic. It was the deep, resonant, physical tether of a fated connection, anchoring her soul directly to the dying child, demanding she wage war against the dark magic, killing him. She would not let him die. She had been cast out and left for dead, but this tiny, broken prince had found her in the dark, and she would burn the world down before she let the shadows take him. Lyra did not hesitate. She carefully scooped the tiny, burning body of the royal heir into her arms, keeping his heavy head supported against her collarbone. The physical contrast was staggering. The cottage around them was a freezing, drafty ruin clinging to the edge of the winter storm, yet the silver fur pressed against her chest radiated the unnatural, blistering heat of a forge. She carried the unconscious wolf pup toward the hearth, her worn boots making no sound on the swept floorboards. Kneeling on the uneven stone, she gently laid the fragile creature as close to the flickering orange flames as she dared, without singeing his beautiful matted coat. The firelight revealed the true, horrific extent of the damage. The laceration on the pup's flank was not a simple animal bite or a hunter's snare wound. It was a jagged, deliberate tear weeping a thick, viscous fluid that smelled sharply of rotting copper and burnt ozone. Beneath the surface of the silver fur, a network of blackened, necrotic veins branched outward from the wound, creeping slowly toward the tiny creature's chest cavity. It was a highly concentrated silver toxin, an illegal, dark alchemy designed to sever a shifter's connection to their own healing abilities. The poison was actively eating the young prince alive from the inside out, turning his own noble blood into a weapon against him. The outcast reached for her woven canvas sack with trembling, urgent fingers. She overturned the meager contents onto the stone floor, completely ignoring the scattered willow bark and dried mint. Her focus zeroed in on a small, tightly bound bundle of golden-veined leaves. It was solar-infused rowan, an incredibly rare botanical anomaly she had cultivated in absolute secrecy behind her former pack's healing dens. The lunar matriarchs considered the plant a forbidden weed, an offensive remnant of the ancient sunborn lineage they had long tried to erase from the territorial histories. To possess it was dangerous. To use it on the Alpha King's only heir was treason of the highest order. She did not care. She retrieved her heavy iron mortar and pestle from the shadows, placing a handful of the dried, brittle rowan leaves into the rusted bowl. Her calloused hands moved with frantic precision, grinding the golden-veined herbs into a fine, dusty powder. The abrasive, scraping sound of the stone echoed loudly in the small, silent room, a harsh rhythm that grounded her racing mind. As the leaves fractured, they released a potent, overwhelming scent of sun-baked earth and sweet summer honey, aggressively pushing back the sickening stench of the silver poison. Lyra reached for the boiling iron kettle hanging over the fire. She poured a small measure of the scalding water directly into the mortar, watching the liquid hiss and bubble as it absorbed the pulverized herb. But hot water and rowan alone would not be enough to break a royal curse. It required a catalyst. It required the very magic she had spent her entire life hiding to survive. Closing her eyes, the resilient healer took a slow, deep breath, pulling the freezing draft of the room into her lungs to anchor her physical body. She focused her mind on the hollow, agonizing void near her collarbone where her pack bond used to reside. The trauma of the rejection still throbbed there, a jagged piece of black ice embedded in her soul. She pushed past the pain, reaching deeper into the dark, silent center of her chest, until she found the tiny, dormant ember of her true lineage. She coaxed the forbidden golden warmth upward. It flowed through her shivering veins like molten sunlight, banishing the winter chill from her limbs and pooling brightly in the tips of her fingers. She pressed her bare, glowing hands directly into the scalding herbal paste. She ignored the burning heat of the water, channeling her raw, solar magic into the poultice. The thick mixture instantly began to glow with a brilliant, blinding golden light, humming with an ancient, resonant frequency that made the floorboards vibrate slightly beneath her knees. The paste was ready, but she knew the application would be absolute agony for the dying child. She shifted closer to the unconscious pup, using her left arm to firmly pin his fragile shoulders against the stone hearth. With her glowing right hand, she scooped up a generous portion of the solar-infused Rowan paste and pressed it directly into the blackened, weeping laceration on his flank. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment the golden magic made contact with the dark silver toxin, a loud, sharp hiss echoed through the cottage, like cold water thrown onto a heated iron anvil. Thick, black smoke erupted from the wound, carrying the vile stench of burning decay. The tiny wolf pup awoke with a horrific, ragged shriek. His body convulsed violently, his heavy paws thrashing against the stones as the solar magic aggressively attacked the poison spreading through his veins. Lyra tightened her grip, leaning her upper body over the thrashing creature to keep him grounded. She absorbed the frantic blows of his tiny, blunt claws against her forearms, refusing to let him break the seal of the poultice. As the pup screamed, a sudden, blinding spike of sympathetic agony ripped through Lyra's own chest. The fated connection that had tethered them moments ago flared to life. Her severed pack scar burned like a branding iron, mirroring the exact intensity of the poison being drawn from the boy's body. She gasped, her vision swimming with black spots, but she did not pull her hand away from the wound. She held the glowing paste firmly in place, forcing her own ancestral warmth into his failing heart, bearing the terrible weight of his suffering as if it were her own. The battle between the dark curse and the golden light raged for what felt like hours. The wind outside the cottage howled in a relentless, shrieking fury, battering the wooden shingles and threatening to break the glass, but inside the small room, the only sound was the desperate, ragged breathing of the healer and the child. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent convulsions began to subside. The thick black smoke rising from the laceration thinned, replaced by the clean, sweet scent of the rowan herb. The blackened, necrotic veins beneath the silver fur slowly receded, dissolving under the relentless pressure of the solar magic. When the pup finally went limp against the stones, his ragged shrieks fading into weak, exhausted whimpers, Lyra pulled her trembling hand away. The golden glow in her fingertips flickered and died, leaving her completely drained. Her shoulders slumped forward, her chest heaving as she fought to draw oxygen into her burning lungs. The wound on the pup's flank was no longer a weeping, poisoned tear. The edges were clean, sealed by a layer of pale, healthy pink tissue. The terrible molten heat radiating from his small body had broken, leaving him shivering in the cold drafts of the floor. She did not stop to rest. Her body was a heavy, aching mass of bruised muscle and profound exhaustion, but the maternal instinct roaring in her blood demanded she finish the task. She carefully wiped the excess poultice from his silver fur with a clean, damp cloth. Then she unfastened her own heavy woolen cloak from the back of the wooden chair. It was slightly damp from the blizzard, but it was the only source of thick insulation she possessed. She wrapped the massive fabric securely around the tiny, shivering wolf, creating a warm, protective cocoon. She gathered the heavy bundle into her arms and sat completely flat against the floorboards, resting her back against the side of the stone hearth. She cradled the prince against her chest, tucking his silver head securely beneath her chin. She closed her arms tightly around him, offering her own core body temperature to combat his violent shivering. The somatic feedback of the fated bond pulsed softly between them now, no longer a jagged spike of agony, but a low, steady thrum of shared survival. Every time his small chest rose, the empty, hollow space beneath her collarbone felt a little less cold. The night stretched into a grueling, silent endurance test. The outcast did not close her eyes. She sat in the dim, flickering light of the dying fire, tracking every single breath the royal heir took. She listened to the brutal winter storm raging across the thornwood border, knowing that somewhere out there, in the freezing dark, The most dangerous alpha king in the realm was tearing the world apart, looking for the exact burden currently sleeping in her arms. She gently traced the intricate, heavy silver lines of the crescent royal emblem, woven into the black dragon leather collar around the pup's neck. It was a terrifying, absolute symbol of power, a marker that promised death to anyone who dared touch the sovereign bloodline. Yet, looking down at the fragile sleeping creature, she felt absolutely no fear of the crown. She only felt a fierce, terrifying devotion. Hours bled away into the quiet darkness. The fire burned down to a pile of glowing, pulsing red embers, casting long, fading shadows across the dusty ceiling beams. Lyra's arms grew entirely numb from holding the awkward, heavy weight of the wolf pup, but she refused to shift her position and risk waking him. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked and bleeding from the dry heat of the hearth, but her entire focus remained anchored on the steady, rhythmic pulse beating against her own chest. Eventually, the relentless howling of the winter gale began to soften, dropping from a deafening roar to a low, mournful whistle through the pines. The pitch-black square of the cracked window slowly began to shift, bleeding into a pale, bruised shade of indigo. Dawn was creeping across the desolate northern border. As the first faint grey light of the morning filtered through the frosted glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air, the creature in Lyra's arms gave a long, deep shudder. The pup's breathing rhythm changed entirely. The short, shallow pants of a wounded animal smoothed out into the slow, deep, resonant intakes of human lungs. A strange, shimmering ripple of silver light swept over the matted fur of the cocooned bundle. Lyra held her breath, keeping her body perfectly still as the ancient magic of the lunar shift took hold of the child. The transformation was not violent or loud. It was a seamless, fluid reknitting of form. The heavy silver wolf anatomy dissolved beneath the folds of the woolen cloak, the bones shifting and shrinking with a soft, magical resonance that hummed against her skin. Within moments, the heavy weight of the massive pup vanished, replaced by the incredibly light, fragile frame of a human child. Lyra gently pulled back the heavy wool fabric to look at the boy hidden inside. He appeared to be no more than 4 or 5 years old. His skin was devastatingly pale, almost translucent in the grey morning light, stretched too tight over a small, prominent ribcage. A mop of pure, silver hair fell messily over his forehead, a direct genetic echo of his terrifying father. The heavy, black dragon leather collar with the crescent royal emblem, which had fit snugly around the thick neck of the wolf pup, now hung incredibly loose over the boy's delicate human collarbones, a massive heavy iron burden on such a small frame. On his pale left side, the clean, pink scar from the silver poison remained, a permanent somatic marker of the night he had almost died. The boy stirred. His small hands, balled into tight fists, twitched against the wool. Slowly, his heavy eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were a stormy, striking shade of grey, identical to the endless winter skies outside the cottage window. They were beautiful, but they were completely wide with stark primal terror. The moment Marith registered his surroundings, the strange, dusty room, the dying embers of the fire, and the unfamiliar woman holding him, he scrambled backward in a state of absolute, silent panic. He kicked his small, bare legs against the floorboards, tearing himself out of the warm woolen cocoon and pressing his thin back hard against the rough, freezing stones of the cottage wall. His tiny chest heaved rapidly, but no sound escaped his lips. He was completely, utterly mute. Lyra did not reach out to grab him. She remembered the cruel hands of her former pack, the way they had dragged her to the altar, the way sudden movements had always preceded a strike. She immediately pulled both her hands back, resting them clearly in her lap, with the palms facing upward, entirely empty. She bowed her head slightly, lowering her shoulders to make her frame appear as unthreatening and small as possible. She remained perfectly seated on the floor, allowing a wide, safe distance between herself and the terrified prince. "I am not going to touch you," the outcast murmured, her voice intentionally soft, completely stripped of any demands or alpha authority. "You are safe here, I promise you." Marith stared at her, his storm-grey eyes darting nervously from her calm face to the heavy iron bolt securing the front door, calculating his routes of escape. He pulled his thin knees tightly to his chest, wrapping his small, trembling arms around his legs in a protective, defensive posture. The silver royal tag dangling from his oversized leather collar clinked softly against the stone wall, the only sound in the quiet, frozen room. He looked so incredibly small, a broken, traumatized heir carrying the weight of a violent kingdom on his narrow shoulders. Moving with deliberate slowness, Lyra turned her torso toward the hearth. She reached for the small wooden bowl she had set aside the night before, filled with a clear, nutrient-rich bone broth she had managed to brew from her sparse supplies. She placed the bowl carefully on the floorboards, exactly halfway between her seated position and the stone wall where the child cowered. "You lost a lot of strength last night," she whispered, keeping her eyes averted so he would not feel challenged by a direct gaze. "You need to drink this. It will help the cold." She leaned back against the hearth, pulling her arms around her own knees, waiting in absolute stillness. The tension in the small room was thick, a delicate, fragile bridge being built over a chasm of fear. For 5 long, suffocating minutes, the boy did not move. He watched her with an intense, analytical focus that belonged to a much older, battle-hardened warrior, checking for any sign of deception or violence. Finding only quiet patience, his raw physical hunger finally overrode his terror. Marith uncurled his small legs. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, hesitating after every few inches, his eyes locked on her face. When she did not twitch or reach for him, he closed the final distance and grabbed the wooden bowl with both hands. He lifted the broth to his lips and drank greedily, the warm liquid leaving a faint, shiny trail down his pale chin. As he finished the last drop, a sudden violent shiver racked his thin frame. The ambient temperature of the drafty cottage was brutally cold against his bare human skin, the winter frost bleeding through the decayed mortar of the walls. He lowered the empty bowl, his small teeth chattering audibly in the quiet room. He looked at the heavy, warm woolen cloak still draped across Lyra's lap. Then he looked up into her empathetic grey eyes. The mute prince did not retreat to the cold stone wall. Instead, he took one hesitant step forward, entirely closing the distance between them. He dropped to his knees right beside her, reaching out a tiny, trembling hand. His small fingers grasped the rough fabric of her worn dress, clinging to the material with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He pressed his cold, pale cheek directly against her arm, seeking the golden, residual warmth that radiated from her skin. Lyra's breath hitched in her throat. The deep, resonant somatic tether of their fated bond flared to life again, anchoring firmly into the very center of her being. It was not a bond forged by pack politics, nor a claim marked by a violent bite. It was an absolute, unyielding maternal connection, a soul-deep vow of sanctuary that locked seamlessly into place. She carefully lifted the edge of the heavy woolen cloak and draped it over the boy's shivering shoulders, pulling him gently against her side. He did not flinch. He simply buried his face against her ribs, letting out a long, silent sigh of complete surrender as his exhausted body finally felt safe. She rested her chin softly on the top of his silver hair, wrapping her arms securely around his fragile frame. She knew exactly what keeping this child meant. The Alpha King's trackers would be scouring every inch of the territories. If the Royal Guard found a banished, low-status outcast harboring the missing heir in a secluded border cottage, they would not ask questions. They would execute her on sight for kidnapping the Crown Prince. She was inviting the wrath of the most brutal predator in the known world directly to her door, but as the small, silent boy tightened his grip on her dress, she knew her decision had already been made the moment she pulled him from the shadows. Because, when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, Something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. She tightened her hold on the sleeping prince, turning her gaze toward the heavy, frost-covered door. Let the king come. Let the armies march. She would tear down the very pillars of the kingdom before she ever let anyone hurt this child again. The blindingly white stillness of the winter morning offered a deceptive illusion of peace. Outside the warped wooden walls of the secluded forest cottage, the violent blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a frozen, silent wasteland. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a delicate, fragile warmth. Lyra Sterling sat on the swept floorboards near the dying hearth, her exhausted body draped protectively over the sleeping form of the young prince. The profound physical toll of her grueling 3-day march through the snow, compounded by the agonizing severing of her former pack bond, had left her muscles screaming in protest, yet she did not move. She remained perfectly still, her chin resting softly against Marith's spun silver hair. The hollow, jagged void near her collarbone, where her old life had been violently ripped away, was now filled with a steady golden hum. It was the undeniable somatic feedback of their fated maternal connection, a deep, resonant tether that pulsed in time with the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the mute child in her arms. She knew this fragile sanctuary could not last. The reality of her situation was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She carefully shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp flare of pain in her bruised knees, and gently untangled herself from the boy's desperate grip. Marith whimpered softly in his sleep, his pale brow furrowing in a silent plea for her returning warmth. Lyra quickly folded her heavy woolen cloak into a makeshift nest, tucking it tightly around his small, fragile shoulders to preserve his core temperature. She reached for the heavy burlap sack resting near the stone hearth, her collused fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding metal hidden inside. She had stripped the black dragon leather collar and its massive crescent royal emblem from his neck the moment he shifted, burying the undeniable proof of his sovereign bloodline deep within the coarse fabric. If anyone caught even a passing glimpse of that silver crest, their lives would end before the sun set. A sudden, sharp rapping at the heavy oak door shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. Lyra's heart violently spiked against her ribs. The golden tether anchoring her soul to the child flared with a sudden icy jolt of pure panic. She spun around, her grey eyes wide, instantly calculating the distance between the hearth and the heavy iron bolt securing the entrance. The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled, demanding voice complaining about the bitter frost. It was not the thunderous, commanding strike of a royal soldier. It was the impatient, shivering rap of a neighbor. Moving with frantic, silent speed, the herbalist rushed back to the sleeping child. She gently shook his narrow shoulder. Marith woke instantly, his stormy grey eyes snapping open, completely devoid of the groggy confusion of a normal boy. He possessed the hyper-vigilant, terrified awareness of a hunted prey. Lyra pressed a single, trembling finger to her lips, silently commanding absolute stillness. She pointed to a loose, wide floorboard near the back corner of the room. A small, recessed root cellar she had discovered while sweeping the dust. The mute prince did not hesitate. He scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees, clutching the heavy woolen cloak tightly around his small frame. He slid seamlessly into the dark, cramped hollow beneath the wood. Lyra quickly slid the heavy board back into place, kicking a thin layer of dead pine needles and dust over the seam to obscure the hiding spot. She took a slow, grounding breath, forcing her racing pulse to slow. She buried the deep, feral protectiveness roaring in her blood, deliberately adopting the slumped, defeated posture of a broken outcast. She unbolted the iron latch and pulled the heavy door open, just enough to block the view of the interior. Tessathorn stood on the frost-covered threshold, shivering violently beneath a frayed, moth-eaten shawl. The older woman was a notorious fixture on the edges of the thornwood border, a bitter, gossiping Omega who survived by trading rumors and scavenged goods. Tessa smelled strongly of stale bread, cheap, fermented berry ale, and a deep, permeating layer of sour envy. Her sharp, calculating eyes immediately tried to peer past Lyra's shoulder, searching the dimly lit cottage for any signs of value. "Moon's mercy, girl. Are you trying to freeze to death?" Tessa complained, her voice a harsh, grating rasp that cut through the crisp winter air. Without waiting for an invitation, the older woman shoved her way past the doorframe, her muddy boots leaving dark, wet tracks across the carefully swept floorboards. She marched directly toward the hearth, holding her wrinkled, trembling hands out toward the glowing embers. I saw the smoke rising from the chimney. Figured the cold had finally driven you mad enough to burn the place down. You look absolutely dreadful. Lyra did not react to the insult. She quietly shut the heavy door, her eyes darting imperceptibly toward the back corner where the floorboards hid her secret. "The crossing was difficult," she murmured, her tone perfectly flat, projecting nothing but the exhausted apathy expected of a rejected mate. She moved toward the rusted iron kettle, offering the mundane hospitality required to keep the older woman pacified. "I have hot water. No tea leaves left, but it will warm your hands." "I did not brave the ice for hot water," Tessa snapped, though she eagerly accepted the cracked ceramic cup Lyra handed her. The older woman took a greedy sip, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied the barren, drafty room. "You picked a terrible time to seek exile on the border, girl. If the winter does not kill you, the madness sweeping the territories certainly will. The entire woodland is crawling with armed scouts." The golden tether in Lyra's chest tightened painfully, a physical warning vibrating against her breastbone. She kept her gaze deliberately lowered, staring at the dark mud melting from Tessa's boots. "Scouts!" she repeated softly, lacing her voice with just enough mild confusion to appear harmless. "Has a rogue pack crossed the boundary line?" Tessa let out a harsh, barking laugh that lacked any genuine humor. "Rogues. If only it were simple rogues. It is the Alpha King's Vanguard. They are tearing the border apart, turning over every stone, and burning every abandoned barn from here to the capital." The older woman leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial, terrified whisper. "They say Kalin Valdron has completely lost his mind. His only heir was stolen from the royal nursery 3 months ago, right out from under the noses of his elite guard. The king is feral. He is executing his own commanders for their failure. His grief is a plague, and he is bringing the infection directly to our doorstep." Tessa Thorne did not know that the quiet, exiled woman pouring her hot water was currently harboring the single most valuable life in the 3 territories. She did not know that the fragile, mute boy the entire royal army was hunting was holding his breath less than 10 feet away. Lyra maintained her absolute chilling composure. She did not tremble. She did not look toward the floorboards. She simply let the silence of her low status act as a shield, absorbing the terrifying weight of the older woman's words, without revealing a single crack in her armor. "They say the king's enforcer is leading the Vanguard," Tessa continued, her voice trembling slightly as the reality of her own gossips settled in. "Varric Druss. The man is a butcher. He does not ask questions, he just burns the answers out of you. If they find you out here alone, unregistered and without a pack mark to protect you, they will assume you are a smuggler, or worse." She drained the rest of her hot water and shoved the empty cup back into Lyra's hands. "Keep your head down, girl, and if you hear thunder on the frozen earth, you run into the deep woods and you do not look back." With her dire warning delivered, the gossiping neighbor pulled her frayed shawl tightly around her neck and hurried back out into the freezing wind, eager to return to the relative safety of her own fortified settlement. Lyra bolted the door the second the older woman was gone. The heavy, oppressive silence of the cottage rushed back in, but it was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was a ticking clock. She rushed to the back corner and pulled up the heavy floorboard. Marith was curled into a tiny, tight ball in the dirt, his small hands clamped firmly over his ears. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from the residual, lingering terror of his kidnapping. She reached down and lifted him out of the cellar, pulling his fragile, trembling frame tightly against her chest. "I have you," she whispered fiercely into his spun silver hair, letting her warm, golden magic pulse softly through the fated bond to soothe his racing heart. "I have you, Marith. You are safe." But she knew the soothing words were a temporary lie. If Varek Druss was leading the Vanguard, the danger was infinitely worse than a desperate father searching for a lost son. The ruthless beater was notorious for his cruelty, and worse, rumors had long circulated in the lower castes that Varek harbored deep, treasonous ambitions for the throne. If the beater had orchestrated the royal coup, he was not searching the woods to rescue the young prince. He was hunting the child to finish the job. Lyra set the boy down gently on the bed, her mind racing with cold, absolute clarity. The silver poison she had drawn from his veins had a distinct, unnatural scent, a vile mixture of ozone, burnt copper, and the sweet, undeniable undertone of royal shifter blood. Even cleansed, the residual scent of a royal pup would linger on the floorboards, practically glowing to the heightened olfactory senses of an elite Vanguard tracker. She needed to mask his presence entirely. She turned back to her scattered canvas sack, dropping to her knees on the stone hearth. Her calloused fingers dug through her meager supplies, discarding the gentle healing herbs in favor of the most pungent, abrasive elements she possessed. She gathered a handful of bitter pine resin, dried crushed nettles, and a thick scoop of wet black ash from the very bottom of the fire pit. Finally, she broke off a tiny, fragile corner of her remaining solar-infused rowan leaf. She threw the entire mixture into her heavy iron mortar and began to grind with furious, relentless physical force. The abrasive, scraping sound filled the small cottage. She did not use water this time. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the hollow void near her collarbone, and summoned the forbidden, ancestral warmth of her sunborn lineage. A brilliant, molten gold light flared in the palms of her hands. She pressed her glowing fingers directly into the dry, abrasive powder. The solar magic ignited the resin instantly. A thick, billowing cloud of acrid, dark grey smoke erupted from the iron bowl. It smelled violently of burning sap, charred earth, and aggressive, blinding heat. It was a suffocating, deeply unpleasant odour that burned the back of the throat and watered the eyes, completely overwhelming the delicate, lingering scent of the young prince. She grabbed the smoking mortar and walked rapidly through the small cottage, wafting the thick grey smoke into every corner, over the bedsheets, and deliberately heavily over the hidden root cellar. The air grew hazy and thick. Marith watched her from the bed, his storm grey eyes wide with silent understanding. He pulled the heavy woolen cloak up over his nose to block the stinging smoke, making himself as small and invisible as possible. Before Lyra could return the iron bowl to the hearth, the ground beneath her boots began to vibrate. It was a low, rhythmic shudder that travelled upward through the frozen earth, rattling the cracked window panes and vibrating the heavy oak door in its frame. It was the terrifying, undeniable thunder of massive, armoured paws and heavy cavalry boots marching in absolute military unison. The Alpha King's Vanguard had arrived. Lyra's breath hitched. She locked eyes with the mute child on the bed. Without a single word, Marith slid silently off the mattress and crawled back into the dark recess of the root cellar, pulling the heavy floorboard perfectly into place above his head. Lyra kicked a pile of swept dust and pine needles over the seam, effectively erasing his existence from the visible world. She walked to the center of the room, standing directly in the path of the door, and waited. The deep, somatic tether of the maternal bond throbbed a steady, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She forced her shoulders to slump, dulling the fierce, glowing defiance in her eyes to match the hollow, broken stare of a low-status outcast. She had survived years of systemic abuse and public humiliation by learning how to become completely invisible to arrogant men. She would use that painful survival skill now as her ultimate armor. The heavy thundering stopped abruptly just outside her cottage walls. The harsh, aggressive snarls of massive shifter wolves echoed through the frozen pines, followed by the heavy, metallic clank of a dismounting soldier. There was no knock. The heavy iron bolt she had secured across the door groaned loudly, and then, with a splintering, violent crash, the solid oak door was kicked open. The winter wind howled into the hazy, smoke-filled room, bringing with it a towering, terrifying figure. Varric filled the shattered doorway. The ruthless beater was an absolute behemoth of a man, clad in thick black leather armor reinforced with heavy iron plating. His face was a map of old jagged battle scars, and his eyes were a cold, dead shade of yellow that held zero empathy. But it was his scent that made Lyra's blood run completely cold. Beneath the expected smell of winter frost and wet wolf fur, the enforcer carried the faint, extra-sweet stench of rotting copper and ozone. It was the exact same chemical signature as the illegal silver poison she had drawn from the dying pup's veins. Tessa's rumors were true. The man leading the rescue party was the very traitor who had ordered the assassination. Varric stepped over the splintered threshold, his heavy, mud-caked boots crushing the frost-covered floorboards. He paused, his scarred nose wrinkling in immediate, violent disgust as the thick, acrid smoke of the burning pine resin and ash hit his sensitive olfactory glands. He coughed, waving a massive armored hand to clear the suffocating air away from his face. "What in the name of the goddess are you burning in here, Omega?" the enforcer demanded, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated with barely contained violence. Lyra kept her head bowed, staring subserviently at the black mud dripping from his boots. She did not cower. She did not raise her voice. She let the silence of her low status act as her absolute shield. "Pine resin and wet ash, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to sell the illusion of a terrified, broken civilian. "The dampness in the wood. It brings a terrible rot. I was trying to clear the air of the mold." Varric's cold, yellow eyes swept the barren, desolate room, completely unimpressed by the staggering poverty of her sanctuary. He stalked forward, his massive frame looming over her small, defensive posture. He did not ask her name. He did not care about her severed pack bond, or why she was living alone on the dangerous border. To a man of his brutal ambition, she was nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared. "We are tracking a fugitive," Varric stated coldly, his gaze lingering on the heavy wooden bed frame in the corner. "A royal asset, silver fur, small, injured. Our trackers followed a faint trail of blood to this sector of the woods before the blizzard washed it out. Have you seen a silver pup near this rotting shack?" The question was a lethal trap. If she hesitated, if her heart rate spiked in a way his heightened hearing could detect, he would execute her without a second thought. Lyra leaned into the agonizing, hollow void left by her old pack, using the genuine, somatic trauma of her rejection to mask the fierce protective thrum of the maternal bond holding the child beneath the floor. "No, my lord," she replied flatly, keeping her breathing perfectly even and shallow. "I arrived only yesterday. The blizzard was blinding. I have seen nothing but snow and shadows. If a wounded creature crossed this threshold, I would have eaten it to survive." The dark, brutal pragmatism of her answer made the ruthless beta pause. He stared down at her, searching for the telltale scent of deception. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until the cold iron of his armor practically brushed against her worn dress. He inhaled deeply, trying to pull a scent from her skin or the floorboards beneath her feet. Lyra held her breath, trusting her magic. The pungent, aggressive smoke of the solar-infused ash completely coated the room, stinging Varric's eyes and overwhelming his predatory senses. The golden magic she had woven into the smoke acted as a perfect, impenetrable veil, completely neutralizing the faint, sweet scent of the silver prince hiding just inches beneath their boots. Disgusted by her poverty, her smell, and her absolute insignificance, Varric Druss finally took a step back. He let out a low, dismissive sneer, turning his massive back on her. "If you are lying outcast, the cold will be the least of your concerns," the enforcer threw over his shoulder as he marched back toward the shattered doorway. "Keep your eyes on the snow. The Alpha King's main host rides less than a day behind us. If they find a silver hair on your property, Kalin Valdron will skin you alive himself." Varric did not bother to pull the broken door shut. He disappeared into the freezing winter mist, shouting harsh, commanding orders to the armored wolves waiting in the tree line. The thundering of heavy paws and cavalry boots gradually faded away, leaving the secluded border cottage drowning in the icy draught of the open doorway. Lyra's knees finally buckled. She collapsed onto the swept floorboards, her entire body shaking with a violent, delayed rush of pure adrenaline. She pressed her hands flat against the wood, gasping for air as the thick, acrid smoke began to clear. She had survived the sweep. She had looked directly into the eyes of the traitor who poisoned the prince, and she had won. But as she crawled toward the back corner to release the terrified, silent boy from the dark root cellar, the golden somatic tether in her chest did not relax. Instead, it began to throb with a new, terrifying intensity. The Vanguard was gone, but the true storm was only just beginning. The ruthless beater had been hunting an asset to destroy it. The man riding a day behind him was a desperate, feral father searching for his soul. And when the Alpha King finally arrived at her broken door, no amount of smoke or silence would be able to hide the absolute truth of their fated connection. The freezing winter wind howled triumphantly through the shattered oak doorway, driving a fresh, merciless wave of razor-sharp ice crystals into the small cottage. Lyra scrambled across the frost-covered floorboards the absolute second the thundering hooves of Varric Druss's Vanguard faded into the distant tree line. Her hands were trembling violently, completely slick with a cold sweat that defied the bitter temperature of the room. She dropped to her bruised knees in the back corner, her raw fingers tearing at the loose wooden plank with frantic, desperate strength. She ripped the heavy board away, coughing as the residual. Acrid smoke of the solar-infused ash stung the back of her throat. Marith was completely curled into a tiny, trembling ball in the dark earth of the root cellar. His small hands were still clamped firmly over his ears, and his stormy grey eyes were squeezed shut in absolute, silent terror. He had heard the voice of the enforcer. He had recognized the brutal, gravelly tone of the traitor who had poisoned him and ripped him from his home. "He is gone," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking as she reached down into the hollow recess. "You are safe, Marith. I am here." She lifted his fragile, feather-light frame out of the dirt, immediately wrapping her arms securely around his shivering shoulders. The boy did not open his eyes. He simply buried his pale face into the curve of her neck, clinging to the worn fabric of her dress with a desperate, white-knuckled grip that threatened to tear the seams. His tiny body was completely rigid, locked in the horrific, paralyzing grip of a trauma no child should ever have to endure. Lyra carried him back to the stone hearth, her heart breaking at the sheer weight of the fear radiating from his small form. She gently deposited the mute prince onto the floorboards near the dying embers, quickly draping the heavy, slightly damp woolen cloak back over his shoulders. But the fragile sanctuary of the cottage had been violently compromised. The heavy iron bolt that had secured them against the blizzard was completely destroyed, and the solid oak door hung crookedly on a single screaming hinge. The lethal cold of the thornwood border was bleeding into the room, rapidly devouring the meager warmth she had fought so hard to create. She could not leave the child exposed to the elements. Lyra turned her back on the hearth, marching toward the heavy, splintered wooden table resting in the center of the room. She pressed her aching shoulders against the solid oak edge, gritting her teeth as she forced her exhausted muscles to obey. She shoved the heavy furniture across the uneven floorboards, the loud, scraping screech echoing off the stone walls until it wedged tightly against the broken doorframe. It was a crude, desperate barricade, but it successfully blocked the worst of the howling wind. When she turned back to the fire, her chest heaved with agonizing, shallow breaths. The physical exertion was slowly draining the last reserves of her stamina, but she refused to surrender. She dropped to her knees beside the hearth, grabbing the iron poker to stir the fading red embers back to life. She tossed the last of her dry birch twigs into the pit, watching the fragile orange flames slowly lick at the wood. The cold was a constant, creeping predator, but the hollow void near her collarbone was what truly demanded her attention. She pressed her hand over her chest, realizing that the hollow mark doesn't just contain your power. It creates a void, an absence, where your magic should be. The brutal severing of her pack bond had left a gaping, jagged emptiness in her soul, a profound absence that made the ambient cold feel 1,000 times more lethal. But as she looked down at the silver-haired boy shivering in the wool, the void began to hum with a deep, resonant warmth. The maternal tether anchoring her to the young prince was a steady, golden pulse, a lifeline that pulled her back from the edge of absolute despair. "We need to rebuild your strength," she murmured softly, keeping her tone incredibly gentle to avoid startling him. "The smoke is gone. The bad men are gone. I am going to heat the broth." Marith finally opened his stormy grey eyes, watching her with a level of intense, analytical focus that completely betrayed his young age. He slowly lowered the woolen cloak from his nose, giving a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. Lyra reached for the rusted iron kettle, pouring the remaining nutrient-rich bone broth into the small wooden bowl. She set it carefully on the warm stones near the fire, allowing the liquid to heat. As she waited, her grey eyes drifted toward the heavy burlap sack resting in the shadows. Inside that coarse fabric lay the massive black dragon leather collar and the crescent royal emblem. She stared at the hidden symbol of absolute sovereign power, her mind slowly turning toward the terrifying reality of the Alpha King. Kalin Valdron was a name that made even the most hardened warriors tremble. He was a colossal, intimidating beast of a man, a ruler cursed with a brutal elemental magic that brought absolute winter to his enemies. Rumors claimed his heart was forged of solid ice, entirely devoid of empathy or mercy. But as Lyra watched the fragile, mute boy sitting on her floor, she wondered about the man behind the terrifying crown. To tear the territories apart, to drive his armies into a feral, exhaustive frenzy, that was not the action of an unfeeling monster. That was the raw, desperate agony of a father who had lost his soul. She understood the pain of being violently separated from the ones you love, and for a fleeting, dangerous moment, a profound wave of empathy for the sovereign washed over her. She picked up the warm wooden bowl and moved back to Marith's side. She sat cross-legged on the swept floorboards, gently pulling the boy entirely into her lap. He settled instantly against her chest, leaning his pale cheek against her collarbone as she offered him the broth. The domestic intimacy of the moment was a stark, beautiful contrast to the desolate ruin of the cottage. They were two broken, discarded outcasts finding absolute safety in the shared warmth of each other's survival. For a quiet, fragile hour, the world outside ceased to exist. But the Thornwood border was completely devoid of mercies, and the illusion of peace was about to shatter. It did not begin with the thunder of hooves, nor the harsh, aggressive snarls of armored wolves. It began with a sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature. Lyra gasped as the ambient air inside the room instantly turned to solid ice. The small, dancing orange flames in the hearth flickered wildly, fighting against an invisible, suffocating pressure before shrinking down to terrified blue sparks. A thick, creeping layer of jagged, crystalline frost bloomed rapidly across the inside of the cracked window panes, spreading like a deadly silver web over the glass. The frost crawled down the stone walls, freezing the damp mortar and chilling the floorboards beneath her boots. It was not a natural weather pattern. It was the devastating, localized manifestation of a supreme elemental curse. The golden, maternal tether in Lyra's chest suddenly flared into a blinding, searing agony. The hollow scar where her old pack bond used to reside began to throb with a molten, terrifying heat, burning so fiercely she thought her skin would catch fire. Her breath hitched, her lungs constricting as an impossibly heavy, dominant aura descended upon the secluded cottage. The sheer atmospheric pressure was crushing, a physical weight that forced the air from the room and commanded absolute biological submission. Lyra thought she was prepared to face the royal army. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. Outside the shattered, barricaded door, silence was absolute and deadly. There were no shouts, no marching orders. Just the heavy, deliberate crunch of massive boots walking slowly across the frozen earth. Massive, terrifying shadows fell across the frosted window panes, completely blocking out the pale grey light of the winter morning. The royal scouts had not just surrounded the perimeter, they had engulfed it. Marith stopped drinking the broth. His small hands tightened convulsively around the wooden bowl, and a low, silent whimper escaped his throat. He recognized the crushing, icy aura bleeding through the walls. "Do not move," Lyra commanded, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate whisper. She immediately shifted her posture, sliding her body forward until she was kneeling directly over the boy. She tucked his small frame securely between her thighs, throwing her own torso protectively in front of him. She raised her chin, burying her terror beneath a mask of absolute, defiant sovereignty, completely prepared to use the forbidden golden fire in her veins to burn the invaders alive. The heavy wooden table she had used as a barricade did not just move. It exploded. The solid oak door, already hanging by a single hinge, was violently obliterated by a force of unimaginable physical power. Splinters of wood and chunks of frozen iron shrapnel tore through the air, clattering aggressively against the far stone wall. The freezing winter wind roared into the small room, bringing with it a swirling, blinding vortex of snow and mist. And standing in the center of the shattered threshold was Kalin. The Alpha King was a terrifying, towering behemoth, a figure of mythic destruction carved from the darkest winter storms. He was clad in heavy, battle-scarred obsidian armor that was completely coated in a thick layer of frozen blood and packed snow. His broad, massive shoulders completely filled the doorframe, projecting an aura of lethal, unhinged violence. His storm-grey eyes, the exact identical shade as the boy trembling behind Lyra, were wild, entirely devoid of reason, completely consumed by the feral madness of a predator who had spent 3 months drowning in grief. He smelled violently of crushed pine, glacial ice, and the coppery, metallic scent of fresh slaughter. Lyra didn't know that the man standing in the doorway had buried 3 women who dared to love him. She didn't know the dark, tragic history of the frost curse that pumped through his royal veins. All she saw was a massive, lethal threat to the child she had sworn to protect. Kalin stepped over the splintered remains of the barricade, his heavy boots echoing like thunderclaps on the floorboards. His feral, glowing eyes immediately locked onto the small, defiant woman kneeling on the floor. He bared his teeth, a low animalistic growl vibrating in his broad chest, fully intending to tear the unknown smuggler limb from limb for daring to occupy the space where his trackers had caught a faint whiff of silver blood. But before the terrifying beast could unleash his violence, his wild gaze dropped. He saw the heavy woolen cloak draped across Lyra's lap. He saw the small, delicate hands clutching a wooden bowl of warm bone broth. And then, peering out from behind the fierce, protective curve of the herbalist's body, he saw a mop of spun silver hair and a pair of wide, terrified storm-grey eyes. The Alpha King froze. The absolute, devastating silence that crashed into the room was heavier than the storm. the terrifying, crushing aura of winter ice hanging in the air abruptly completely vanished, entirely replaced by a shocking, breathless vacuum. The ruler's massive hands, curled tightly into lethal fists, slowly unspooled, his heavily armored fingers trembling violently at his sides. He forgot how to breathe. He forgot the army waiting outside in the snow. He forgot the brutal war he had waged across 3 territories. The feral madness in his eyes shattered instantly, completely dissolving into the raw, agonizing vulnerability of a broken father. "Marith," the king breathed, his deep, gravelly voice cracking completely in half. The single word was a ragged, weeping prayer that tore right through the freezing air. The young prince stared at the towering sovereign in the doorway. He did not run. He did not cower. Slowly, tentatively, the boy lowered the wooden bowl to the floorboards. He untangled himself from Lyra's protective embrace and took one small, hesitant step forward, his pale face looking up at the colossal leader who had torn the world apart to find him. As Kalin's gaze shifted from his miraculously healed son to the fiercely protective woman, still kneeling on the floor, a second, infinitely more powerful cosmic event detonated inside the small cottage. The hollow, jagged void near Lyra's collarbone did not just hum. It erupted. A blinding, searing pulse of pure, molten gold fire shot through her veins, entirely bypassing her conscious control. The ancient, forbidden magic of her sunborn lineage roared to life in direct, violent response to the sheer, overwhelming elemental ice radiating from the intruder. Kalin staggered backward, his combat boots slipping on the frost, his massive chest heaved violently, his hand flying up to clutch at his own heart, the deep, ancestral-claiming mark hidden beneath his obsidian armor, a mark that had remained entirely dormant and frozen for his entire adult life, suddenly flared with a blistering, inescapable heat. It was not a political alliance. It was not a pack ceremony. It was the absolute, undeniable, physical collision of a true fated mate bond. The realization hit the broken father like a physical blow. The quiet, calloused woman, kneeling in the dirt of a rotting cottage, had not only saved his stolen heir from a lethal silver poison, she possessed the exact, missing half of his soul. The golden warmth radiating from her small frame was actively melting the centuries-old frost curse, slowly killing him from the inside out. The terrifying, ruthless commander of the Northern Territories looked at the resilient, exiled herbalists. The winter storm in his eyes melted into a burning, molten gold. And then, right in front of the massive elite Vanguard waiting in the snow, Kalin Valdron slowly sank to his knees, utterly and completely yielding his sovereign power to the woman who held his world in her hands. The absolute, deafening silence stretching across the ruined border cottage was heavier than the winter blizzard raging outside. Kalin Valdron, the most feared and ruthless Alpha King in the known territories, remained firmly on his knees upon the frost-covered floorboards. The towering sovereign did not move. He did not issue a single command to the elite Vanguard waiting in the freezing mist beyond the shattered doorway. His broad, massive shoulders, clad in battle-scarred obsidian armor, trembled violently under the crushing weight of a miraculous, impossible reality. The feral, unhinged madness that had driven him to tear the continent apart for 3 agonizing months was entirely gone. In its place was the raw, devastating vulnerability of a broken man who had just had his entire soul handed back to him by a banished outcast. Between the kneeling king and the fiercely protective herbalists stood the tiny, fragile form of the mute prince. Marith stared at the colossal beast of a father he had been stolen from. For a long, suffocating moment, the child simply breathed, his small chest rising and falling in the sudden, shocking warmth of the room. Then, with a quiet, shuffling step, the boy closed the final distance. He reached out a tiny, trembling hand, his pale fingers brushing against the cold, frozen blood, caking the heavy iron plating of Kalin's chest. The Alpha King let out a ragged, agonizing sob that tore right through the quiet air. He dropped his massive, calloused hands to the floorboards, completely disregarding his own strength, and pulled the young prince into his chest. Kalin buried his face into the spun silver hair of his son, his massive frame shaking as he wept with a profound, desperate relief that echoed in the very stones of the cottage. He held the boy with a terrifying gentleness, terrified that if he squeezed too hard, the illusion would shatter and he would wake up back in the endless, freezing nightmare of his empty throne room. Marith wrapped his thin arms around his father's thick neck, burying his face into the cold armor, his own silent tears leaving clean tracks through the dust on his pale cheeks. Lyra stood perfectly still near the dying hearth, her chest heaving as she watched the emotional reunion. She did not intrude, she did not speak. She simply allowed the intense, blinding flare of her sun-born lineage magic to slowly recede from her fingertips, though the deep, resonant pulse of the fated mate bond continued to throb relentlessly against her collarbone. The golden, molten warmth in her veins was a constant, physical tether, locking her biological rhythm perfectly into sync with the massive, weeping predator across the room. She could physically feel the heavy, suffocating agony of the ancestral frost curse receding from Kalin's chest. Her very presence in the room was actively melting the centuries-old ice that had poisoned his royal bloodline, replacing the bitter, lethal cold with the soft, summer heat of a sun-baked meadow. Outside the shattered doorway, the hardened soldiers of the royal Vanguard stood in absolute, stunned paralysis. These were lethal, elite warriors who had marched through hellfire and blizzards at their king's command, men who had witnessed Kalin Valdron slaughter entire enemy battalions without blinking. Now they watched in breathless shock as their terrifying, untouchable monarch wept openly on the floor of a rotting shack, entirely yielding his sovereign aura to a small, ragged woman holding a wooden bowl. Weapons were slowly, silently lowered. The aggressive snarls of the massive cavalry wolves faded into soft, confused whines as the unnatural winter frost coating the trees began to drip and melt under the sudden influx of golden magic. Slowly, Kalin lifted his head, his storm-grey eyes, bright with unshed tears, locked onto Lyra's face. The physical distance between them was only a few feet, but the energetic pull of the fated connection made it feel as though they were sharing a single, unified breath. The Alpha King did not rise. He remained on his knees in the dirt, surrounded by the splintered ruins of the heavy wooden barricade, completely submitting his overwhelming physical dominance to the small, collused woman standing before him. He looked at the quiet, resilient healer, his gaze tracing the exhausted lines of her face, the mud caking her worn dress, and the fierce, protective fire still burning in her grey eyes. He saw exactly what she had endured to keep his child alive. "You saved him," Kalin whispered, his deep, gravelly voice entirely stripped of its usual terrifying authority. It was a raw, reverent confession that vibrated in the damp floorboards. The trackers found traces of the illegal silver poison in the snow. "They told me he was already gone. They told me to prepare a pyre, but you pulled him back from the dark." Lyra kept her chin raised, maintaining the quiet, unyielding sovereignty she had forged in the brutal fires of her exile. "He found me in the dark," she corrected softly, her grey eyes unwavering as she met the intense, burning gaze of the sovereign. "The poison was designed to sever his healing. I simply gave him my warmth." Kalin's gaze dropped to the faint, glowing pulse still lingering near her collarbone, right where the jagged scar of her severed pack bond used to rest. The realization of what she truly was, what she possessed, washed over his battle-weary face. The scent of sweet summer honey and ancient solar magic completely overwhelmed the metallic stench of his armor, rushing into his lungs like a life-saving breath. "You are the missing half," he murmured, his hands gently releasing Marith to press flat against the floorboards in absolute, unquestionable surrender. "For 30 years, I have burned from the inside out with a curse of pure ice. No healer, no elder, no magic could touch the frost, and yet, the moment you looked at me, the ice shattered. He shifted his weight, his heavy knees dragging across the wood as he moved a fraction of an inch closer to her boots. He looked up at her, completely laying his soul bare, offering her a vulnerability he had never shown another living creature. "Come back with me. Let me protect you. Let me give you the world you deserve." Lyra did not instantly melt into his words. The trauma of her past was a heavy, suffocating cloak she could not simply cast aside on the promise of a beautiful moment. She remembered the cruel laughter of her former pack. She remembered the public humiliation at the ceremonial altar, the absolute, stony indifference of the men who had promised to protect her, but discarded her the moment she was deemed defective. A sudden, terrifying wave of self-preservation roared to life inside her chest, cold and sharp. She took a deliberate half-step backward, putting a clear, physical boundary between herself and the kneeling monarch. "I was cast out," Lyra stated, her voice trembling but entirely resolute, demanding that he hear the absolute truth of her existence. "I was stripped of my name, my rank, and my dignity, because my former pack deemed me useless. I was forced to walk into a blizzard because a man decided I was not worthy of his protection." She looked down at the massive, lethal commander kneeling at her feet. "I will not be a secret to be hidden away in a royal tower. I will not be a temporary warmth to thaw your curse, only to be discarded when the political winds shift. I have built a sanctuary here in the dust, Kalin Valdron, and I will not trade it for a gilded cage." Kalin did not flinch at her harsh words. He did not attempt to use his commanding aura to force her compliance, nor did he offer empty, defensive platitudes. He absorbed her fear, her pain, and her fierce, unbroken pride, and he honored it completely. He reached up, his massive hands moving with agonizing slowness, and unclasped the heavy, obsidian-plated mantle from his broad shoulders. He let the incredibly valuable, battle-worn armor fall heavily to the floorboards, a physical, undeniable gesture of disarming his lethal capacity before her. "You will never be a secret," the Alpha King swore, his voice resonating with a deep, absolute truth that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. "You will be my equal, my sovereign, the queen of the Northern Territories." He looked at the mute prince, who had moved to stand directly beside Lyra, seeking her protective shadow. "I failed to protect my son because I trusted the wrong men. Varek Druss and his conspirators will be dismantled. I will tear down the very pillars of the stronghold and rebuild it with my bare hands, if that is what it takes to make you feel safe." He pressed his forehead against the floorboards, a gesture of submission so profound and absolute that the elite Vanguard soldiers standing outside in the snow collectively gasped, stepping back as if they had witnessed a god fall from the sky. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children, because monsters do not search for months, because monsters do not look at me the way you do. But Kalin Valdron was no longer a monster. He was a devoted, desperate mate, offering his lifeblood to the only woman who could hold it. "I offer you absolute sanctuary," Kalin continued, his breath warming the cold wood beneath him. "No member of the court will ever raise their voice to you. No pack will ever question your worth. You will rule beside me, or I will not rule at all. This is my blood vow. I am yours to command." Lyra stared down at the massive, terrifying sovereign who had literally laid his kingdom at her worn, mud-caked boots. The deep, resonant pulse of their fated connection hummed in absolute, undeniable harmony, a beautiful, flawless integration of ice and fire. She looked at Marith, who was watching her with those wide, storm-grey eyes, his small hand reaching out to firmly grasp the fabric of her dress. The child needed his father. The father needed his cure. And for the first time in her entire life of silent isolation, Lyra realized that she needed them just as much. The hollow void in her chest was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective love that demanded to be nurtured and expanded into the light. Slowly, deliberately, the exiled herbalist closed the distance. She dropped to her knees on the frost-covered floorboards, sitting directly in front of the Alpha King. She reached out her small, calloused hands, the golden fire of her sunborn lineage magic flaring brightly in her fingertips and gently cupped Kalin's scarred, ice-cold face. The moment her skin made contact with his cheek, a massive shockwave of pure, molten heat exploded through the cottage, completely vaporizing the remaining frost on the walls and turning the freezing air into a warm summer breeze. Kalin gasped, leaning heavily into her touch, his eyes closing as decades of agonizing, internal winter were instantly, permanently melted away. "Take us home, Kalin," Lyra whispered, her voice soft, but carrying the undeniable, absolute authority of a true queen. 2 weeks later, the brutal, howling blizzards of the Thornwood border felt like the distant, fading memory of another lifetime. The massive, towering spires of the royal stronghold, carved from ancient black granite and iron, stretched proudly toward a clear, brilliantly blue sky. The oppressive, perpetual winter that had gripped the capital for decades had entirely broken. In its place, a mild, beautiful spring was rapidly taking hold, a direct, environmental reflection of the golden, solar magic now residing at the very heart of the kingdom. Lyra stood on the expansive, sunlit balcony overlooking the royal gardens. She was no longer dressed in the heavy, damp wool and worn boots of a banished outcast. She wore a stunning, flowing gown of silver and spun gold silk, the exquisite fabric catching the morning light and reflecting a radiant, ethereal glow that made the palace servants bow their heads in genuine reverence as they passed. The jagged, ugly scar of her severed pack bond was completely gone, replaced by a beautiful, intricate golden claiming mark that rested perfectly against her collarbone. The mark pulsed with a steady, comforting warmth, an ever-present reminder of the massive, protective force anchored eternally to her soul. The transition from the rotting, drafty cottage to the immense luxury of the palace had been swift and absolute. Kalin had kept every single syllable of his blood vow. The moment they had arrived at the stronghold, the Alpha King had systematically purged the traitorous elements from his ranks. Varek Druss and the corrupt Beta faction that had orchestrated the royal coup and the kidnapping of the young prince were publicly, permanently dismantled. Their names were stricken from the ancestral ledgers, and their influence was completely erased from the territories in a series of swift, brutal trials that left the court trembling in the wake of the king's restored clarity. Justice had been uncompromising, leaving zero room for any future threats to the new queen's safety. Even more satisfying than the retribution was the sheer, silent shock of the elite lunar matriarchs during her public coronation. The haughty nobles, who had spent their entire lives suppressing the ancient lineages, were forced to drop to their knees and swear fealty as Lyra's forbidden sunborn lineage magic bathed the throne room in blinding, undeniable golden light. She had not raised her voice to demand their respect. She had simply let her sovereign magic speak, and the entire kingdom had answered with absolute submission. Lyra rested her hands on the smooth, warm stone of the balcony railing, her grey eyes scanning the vibrant, sprawling gardens below. The courtyard, once a barren, frozen wasteland of dead earth, was now blooming with vibrant life. Along the edges of the manicured stone pathways, carefully tended patches of solar-infused rowan leaf were already beginning to sprout, their golden-veined leaves soaking in the warm sunlight. It was a beautiful, public integration of her once-forbidden magic into the very foundation of the royal estate, a living testament to her survival. A sudden, joyous sound drifted up from the garden paths, breaking the quiet serenity of the morning. Lyra smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to her eyes. Down below, Marith was running across the lush green grass. The young prince was completely transformed from the fragile, terrified, and mute child she had pulled from beneath a dusty bed. His pale cheeks were flushed with healthy, vibrant color, and his spun silver hair bounced wildly as he chased a small, wooden-carved wolf across the lawn. He was laughing, a loud, bright, ringing sound that echoed beautifully off the ancient stone walls. The traumatic silence that had locked his vocal cords had slowly melted away under the constant, unconditional warmth of his new mother's care. He was safe, he was loved, and he was thriving in the light. He runs faster every day, a deep, gravelly voice murmured from the doorway behind her. Lyra turned as Kalin stepped out onto the balcony. The Alpha King was a magnificent sight, dressed in a tailored tunic of deep charcoal and silver, entirely devoid of his heavy battle-scarred obsidian armor. The feral, unhinged madness that had once clouded his storm-grey eyes was entirely absent, replaced by a profound, anchored peace that radiated from his massive frame. The terrible, suffocating pressure of his ancestral frost curse was completely gone, leaving him healthy, vibrant, and incredibly gentle in her presence. He crossed the stone floor, his large boots making almost no sound, and immediately wrapped his massive arms around her waist from behind. He pulled her back against his broad, solid chest, resting his chin comfortably on the top of her head. Lyra leaned naturally into his embrace, her hands coming up to rest over his thick forearms. The somatic feedback of their fated connection hummed in a state of absolute, unbreakable perfection. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against her spine, a physical drum that promised her endless sanctuary against any storm the world might conjure. "He is happy," Lyra replied softly, watching their son tackle the wooden toy in the grass. "He feels us safe here. We both do." Kalin tightened his hold, pressing a soft, reverent kiss into her hair. "You gave him back his voice," the sovereign whispered, his tone thick with an emotion he reserved only for her ears. "You gave me back my soul. Every time I look at you, I realize how incredibly close I came to losing everything to the ice. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never know the cold again." She turned slightly in his arms, looking up into the striking, handsome face of her true mate. The deep lines of stress and grief had smoothed out, revealing a man who was entirely, unconditionally devoted to his family. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the strong line of his jaw. She thought back to the horrific pain of her public rejection. At the ceremonial altar, the cruel laughter of the men who had cast her out into the blizzard, expecting her to die in the snow because she was not enough for their ambitions. She realized now, standing in the golden warmth of a restored empire, that the rejection had not been a punishment at all. It had been a violent, necessary redirection of destiny. "Thank you for letting me go." Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The Alpha King leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, slow kiss that tasted of sweet summer honey and absolute devotion. The golden fire of her sunborn magic flared softly beneath her skin, meeting the cool, protective strength of his lunar power in perfect cosmic balance. The massive stone fortress around them stood as an impenetrable shield against the world, but the true sanctuary was right here, in the quiet, shared warmth of their embrace. Below them, in the thriving sunlit garden, Marith looked up at the balcony. The young prince smiled broadly, waving his small hand at the parents who had fought through poison, curses, and storms to build a mended world. Lyra waved back, her heart overwhelmingly full. The broken, invisible outcast was gone forever. She was Lyra Valdron, Queen of the Northern Territories, Vessel of the Sun, and she had finally found her way home.